The main big story we need to talk about is one of our fellow podcasters, the most successful podcaster in South Africa, a man who has genuinely revolutionized podcasting, made it into an industry, attracted lots of people to podcasting overall, and kind of created the audience and the scene for podcasting through his own success. It's obviously Mac G with his unbelievably popular and successful show, Podcast and Chill, which has been the center of an absolute storm of controversy and discourse over the last week or more since he made, in my personal opinion, unacceptable comments about South African super celebrity Minnie Dlamini and her breakup from a quite high profile relationship. And so in the last week, a lot of people have been saying, maybe we should regulate podcasting. And this Mac G Minnie Dlamini incident has caused a massive cultural explosion, a massive gender war, a massive kind of class war, like in the discourse over Mac G, who listens to him. And basically, whether or not on the one hand, do you believe that Mac G's comments about Minnie Dlamini are part of a misogynistic, patriarchal attempt to belittle, control, and humiliate women? Or on the other hand, do you believe that Mac G is just another successful black man who's made it against the odds that people are now trying to crush, cut down, and cancel? Just before we get into that story first, the T's and C's of the show, of course, we have a WhatsApp line. The number is 0607613436. You can send us messages, voice notes, and texts at any and all times, and we will incorporate them into the show. We generally put the WhatsApp line onto the pure audio podcast part of the show, not onto YouTube, because if you didn't know, the audio podcast is actually the full show. YouTube is mainly the news stories. So again, if you've been living under a complete rock, Mac G is by far the most successful podcaster in South Africa. He's like reached Joe Rogan levels of cultural, I guess, penetration in South Africa. He has a podcast called Podcast and Chill. It's got other voices on it. His sidekick on the show is Saul Penduka. He's a well-known broadcaster also. And they talk about celebrity gossip. They talk about shenanigans of high-profile South Africans. They talk about politicians. They talk about basically anybody high-profile, and they have a lot of them on for interviews, and they have done phenomenally well. Like millions and millions of subscribers and listeners. They are by far and away the most successful South African online show, exclusively online show. They recently signed a deal with DSTV to create content for them, that which is a marker of how well they've done. The fact that legacy visual or audiovisual, which I mean is television media, wants some of what they're making on their traditional platforms, because like the Mac G's of the world are such a threat now to traditional television that traditional television wants them on their shows and on their channels also. And Mac G has always courted a lot of controversy. One of the reasons why he started Podcast and Chill is that he kept losing his job at big famous radio stations because he was considered what maybe you don't know this, but there's a term in live broadcast entertainment, particularly radio, called a flight risk, which essentially means that because you're going out live to air directly, you're essentially the pilot of the plane. In that moment, even though you don't own the radio station or the TV channel, even though you have bosses and people above you, whatever you say goes straight to air. So whatever you do is the show and is the channel or the radio station in that moment, just like the pilots of a plane. And so if you can't be trusted with that responsibility to not do anything that is against the brand, against the station's kind of principles, or anything that is illegal or undesirable for commercial partners, if you can't be trusted to be safe with the brand and with the broadcast, you're considered a flight risk. And that makes perfect sense. And Mac G moved through quite a few different radio stations before Podcast and Chill. And Saul Penduka also actually lost his job at 5FM. He was on 5FM's breakfast show at the time, I think, for an extremely off-color joke about the sister of a murderer. I can't quite remember the story. And so they were deemed flight risks and like untrustworthy to have on air, even though Saul now works on Kaya FM's breakfast show. So he's been able to make the about turn, but kind of off of the Podcast and Chill success. But all of that kind of discourse, that kind of content that has got no space on traditional legacy media now is what they put into Podcast and Chill. And it's done phenomenally well, even as much as it has upset a lot of people, because they say things about famous high-profile people that are character damaging. and are not always backed up by fact or evidence. Lots of use of the word apparently or allegedly or I heard. And when they get in trouble for besmirching people's reputations, broadly, their response and the response of their fans is, lighten up, it's a joke. It's just a joke. Why are you taking this so seriously? And that is kind of how MacG has been for a long time and reached this enormous level of fame to the point where if he says something that gets the attention of or speaks on literally, I think am I remembering right? I think he spoke on the Mandelas, and one of the Mandelas then came on the show, or at least contacted the show to talk about it. He's also spoken about ministers who then appeared on the show. He's spoken on all of these massive celebrities who then come on the show to talk back to what he said. So that is his level of cultural power now and influence and social influence over South Africa. He is bigger and more influential than many, many TV stations, many, many radio stations, and many, many politicians and public people, musicians, actors, and the rest. Okay, it was early last week or maybe late the week before. MacG was speaking on Podcast and Chill about a high-profile breakup involving Minnie Dlamini, one of the most famous South African celebrities, certainly one of the most famous Black women celebrities. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what he said. You probably already know exactly what he said. But he basically implied that, or no, not implied. He directly said that apparently Minnie Dlamini couldn't keep a man or whatever because she was sexually unclean. She stank. He spoke on her genitalia. He spoke on her private parts. And it was like, firstly, such a wild thing to say. And that caused an absolutely explosive uproar across South African social media and amongst people on the street because so many people heard it. It involves Minnie Dlamini, who's got so many fans and is generally incredibly high profile. Is that a fair summary of where we are, the state of MacG, now that we can actually talk about it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. So what's been the discourse since then? The discourse since then on the one side has been very, very, very many people, and not just Black women or women, but many, many, many people saying you can't talk about women like that. That is so humiliating, so disrespectful, so denigrating of Minnie Dlamini. So awful because it comes from a lineage throughout human history of men trying to control and humiliate and silence and degrade women through casting spurious allegations on their ability to be clean, their cleanliness, their desirability, their sex organs, whether or not it is their fault that they can keep a man, whether or not they can do something as basic as like not be dirty or soiled. And for him to say that comes from a long line of men using that kind of comment, using that kind of allegation to humiliate women. And it is absolutely certain that that kind of, it is obvious, you know this for sure, that is the way that many men talk about women all the time in South Africa and around the world. And that when people like MacG do that, it confirms for men and affirms men who speak like this of what they are doing themselves when they talk like that. It inspires young men and boys to think about women like that and to turn whether or not a woman can keep herself clean, sexually desirable, and decently bodily functioning into a big joke that is really just an unbelievably humiliating put down of women. So that's on the one side. And also on a part of that, on that same side of the discourse is a discussion about how high-profile women are often used for broadly men to put their desires and fantasies into, to project their insecurities onto. Mihlali is another great example of that. Bonang is another great example of that, where South African men, and again, this is men around the world, it's not just South African men, kind of talk on them and imbue a lot of their fantasies and a lot of their aspirations into them, but then also express a lot of their insecurities through denigrating them. And that, again, has a real world effect in everyday life between men and women and the way that men behave in a country that is so riddled by a gender-based violence pandemic that largely South African men, politicians and police leaders and security forces leaders have utterly failed to stop or arrest or slow down. So that's on the one side. On the other side of the discourse is people saying, it was just a joke, get over yourselves, and saying you're just attacking and cutting down another Black man who made it. Because there is a big discourse in South Africa about how black men are constantly under attack and under threat, and people are trying to cancel them and cut them down to size and remove the success that they've created for themselves. And the defense of MacG in this moment has been, you're blowing this out of proportion. The feminists are winning, whatever that means. And you're just trying to destroy a talented, hardworking young man's career, as you have done to so many others. And I largely don't buy that in this case. I am well on the other side of the discourse that I described earlier. But I must acknowledge, I think we must acknowledge, that there are many black men who are cut down for reasons that they do not deserve to be cut down for because of deeply societally held racism. That just is true. The way that black male celebrities are treated versus white male celebrities is completely different. The way that, like Kagiso Rabada, for example, who has been denigrated by the world cricketing organizations, particularly in England and elsewhere, for being overly aggressive and overly hectic, and even suffered penalties and sanctions in cricket matches for behaving in ways which is just sporting and committed and strong and sure, a little bit aggressive, but that's what competitive sport is. There is aggression in it. And white cricket players, male cricket players, have acted in far more dramatic and overly aggressive and worse ways than Kagiso Rabada, but have got no such penalties or sanctions or discourse. So it is absolutely true that racism across South African life and around the world does tend to cut down black men more quickly than white men. But at the same time, racism plus sexism cuts down black women so fast and cuts them down to size and humiliates them and removes their value and worth so fast. And for the people on the side of the discourse defending MacG, surely you see that that is what he has done to Minnie Dlamini, an incredibly powerful woman who is now having to sit through a whole country speaking on her genitalia, her sex life, her desirability. Surely you must see that the same defense that you are leveling of MacG intersectionally applies to what MacG did to Minnie Dlamini, who is also now in an impossible bind, right? Because if she comes out and speaks on it, that just makes it worse. It fuels the fire. If she says, this was outrageous, how dare you, MacG, then that makes it worse. If she says it was no big deal, then that just, undercuts all the people who are supporting her. And if she says nothing, well, then she's just silenced. She's got no voice. That is what MacG did through these comments. And I personally do not support that. I don't support any woman or any person being put in such an impossible bind where no matter what you do, you lose. Fair? I think that's all the discourse covered.
Absolutely.
Fair?
Yeah.
So now there's this broader discussion about whether or not podcasting should be regulated the way that traditional media is regulated. On the one hand, there are people saying that the point of the internet is freedom and freedom of speech and freedom from regulation. And so people are able to really be themselves and say the things that society doesn't want them to say, the kind of Joe Rogan kind of argument. And on the other hand, there are people saying, no, the internet now for the first time is creating platforms and shows that are as big, if not bigger than, and more impactful than traditional media shows and channels and stations. And so, of course, we should regulate them because the reason we regulate big media and legacy media is because of their influence, because of their impact on the discourse. And MacG it definitely, as I said earlier, is bigger than many radio stations, bigger than many TV stations. The interesting situation here is that you might be thinking, we don't need regulations of podcasting. If somebody like MacG says something like this and someone like Minnie Dlamini is upset, there are defamation laws, you can take them to court. But the reason why we have a Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa is because defamation lawsuits are expensive and complicated and take an incredibly long time in the courts. They're incredibly onerous and cumbersome and a waste of time often. Whereas a regulatory body that just can move much faster on an agreed upon set of norms and principles in an industry can go, no, that's not acceptable, and move fast and deal with it, impose a fine, impose a sanction, whatever. Now, obviously, it's hard to do that when someone's show is going out on YouTube and Spotify or whatever, because the BCCSA and others don't have agreements with Spotify or YouTube and the rest, which means that anything that goes out on those platforms falls under the BCCSA's jurisdiction. And so it would be very complicated to try and create a set of laws that hold podcasters, or at least internet creators, to account. And obviously, you're right if you're thinking it is a slippery slope, because this could lead to the government, no matter who's in government, using these kinds of laws to call out and punish and intimidate and threaten anybody on the internet who disagrees with them or says something that is true, that the government doesn't want people to understand is true. I'm thinking about all of these gaslighting politicians who want you to believe that they stopped the VAT increase when they did not. Now imagine if they had the powers to basically take people out on the internet to stop that. But as with all things, there has to be some point in the middle between the extremes to go, there can be consequences when someone, like with these MacG comments on Minnie Dlamini, has so clearly done something unacceptable that has real life victims. And ironically, for the freedom of speech fighters who say, you can't stop, like freedom of speech on the internet is the point is, as I described earlier, you know who's got no freedom of speech now is Minnie Dlamini, because she has been so fundamentally silenced. Of course, you might in like a cheap way without really taking my argument seriously say, oh, but she can speak. But I've already laid out to you that her options are shit. Meaningfully, she has been silenced. And a lot of other people, a lot of other women have been silenced in the past by similar behavior. And if we're taking seriously the crisis of gender-based violence and patriarchal, misogynistic ill treatment of women by men, then we need to be serious about male creators on the internet too. So I don't know what the solution is. I don't think hauling MacG in front of Parliament is sensible at all. At all. I don't think that's going to achieve anything. But I do hear that we should, as a country, at least in my opinion, investigate how to create nimble and effective and speedy laws governing how people disseminate information on the internet, so that there can be meaningful consequences and disincentives for people to so clearly screw up, to like not so clearly screw up. Because, I mean, Moja Love, the TV channel, they came out instantly and they denounced what MacG said. And we all know that he could never have said that without consequences on television or the radio underneath the BCCSA's jurisdiction or the press ombuds jurisdiction. We all know that. But he did get to say it on the internet. And that is something I think we as a country need to seriously consider.